Hi, good afternoon from Washington, D.C. My name is Evelyn McCoy, and I'm a senior manager in our Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute. I'm really excited to be moderating our panel today as part of the Prison Research Meets Practice series, and this is under our Prison Research and Innovation Initiative that is funded by Arnold Ventures. So I would like to introduce our fantastic panelists today. First, we have Michelle Daniel Jones. She is the founder and board president of Constructing Our Future and the co-founder of the Indiana Women's Prison History Project and ABD at New York University. Our additional panelist is Emily Salisbury. She is an associate professor at the College of Social Work at the University of Utah, as well as director of the Utah Criminal Justice Center. And then also we have Amanda Woolford, who is our director of women's programs at the Maine Department of Corrections, as well as a fellow at New York University Marion Institute. So a few housekeeping items before we get started. The event is being recorded and we will share the recording afterwards. We also have closed captioning that's available for accessibility, and you can adjust those settings as you see fit. If you're having difficulty with those settings, please feel free to reach out, and then we will help you navigate those. Our speaker bios are available online, and all of our webinar participants are muted. We will also have time for question and answer in the chat, and then we will answer those for about the last 20 minutes or so. And then we also have a survey at the end of the event. And then we hope that you do take the survey so we can improve these moving forward and have your feedback. Thank you. Okay, so now before we jump into the discussion with our panelists, I wanted to provide just some brief framing of our conversation for the audience today. So women are one of the fastest growing incarcerated populations, and between 1980 and 2020, the number of incarcerated women grew by nearly 500%, and that's at twice the growth rate for incarcerated men. And we also know that there are significant racial and ethnic disparities for women in prison. So Black and Latina women are incarcerated at much higher rates than white women. And while we've seen that the prison population has significantly decreased over the last decade or so, those decreases have been much more notable for men than for incarcerated women. We also know that incarcerated women often have significant childhood and adulthood trauma exposure and victimization histories prior to incarceration. And then those experiences can be aggravated once someone enters the prison environment. And lastly, more than half of women in prisons have children younger than the age of 18 and are mostly the primary caregivers prior to incarceration. So that gives a flavor of who are women in prison, what are the different needs that they may have, and the challenges as a high-level overview. And then lastly, I wanted to share that the programs, policies, and practices in prison that we have seen over time have been largely developed for men who have constituted the majority of the prison population. However, there's an increased attention and focus on meeting the needs of incarcerated women and developing programs, practices, and policies to that end. And so I'm excited again to be joined by our panelists today, and I'm going to start the conversation with Emily. So Emily, research that you and others have conducted over the last 20 years or so really demonstrate that women have specific pathways to criminal legal system involvement, and those pathways are quite different from men. Could you provide an overview of those pathways and what the research tells us about them?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Evelyn. So, the pathways perspective in this sort of academic discourse really recognizes, again, as you mentioned, the various biopsychosocial realities that are unique to women and girls, and that sort of synthesizes these factors into important theoretical and empirical trajectories that capture how they get caught up in the criminal justice system. And I do sort of say caught up because in a lot of ways, women pose far less risk. And I think that's important to sort of emphasize the fact that they pose oftentimes far less risk in terms of committing offenses and ongoing offenses in our system. So really, this perspective, the pathways perspective, really understands or starts with an understanding that gender and race matter when we think about and consider how women enter and exit our system. So we can't really talk about justice-involved women without talking about, as you mentioned, prior trauma and victimization and ongoing trauma and victimization that women have experienced. When 1 out of 5 women in the general population in this country, in the United States, have experienced, rape or attempted rape, that's you and me, right? Like that, those are figures that are in the general population. And when we get to women who've been incarcerated and who are incarcerated, those figures get really staggering and quite abhorrent. And so the discussions about pathways and understanding how we get to a place where understanding how trauma affects the body, how trauma has ongoing effects throughout a person's lifetime, really do matter. And also how women and girls experience traumatic events very differently oftentimes because of gender norms and gender sort of social forces. So trauma, of course, is one piece to this. Unhealthy intimate relationships, which oftentimes are related to the relational violations that women have experienced, are also very key to how women are ending up in our systems. Oftentimes women don't know what love is unless a man or a partner puts his hands on her. What I mean by that is it becomes so normalized, the trauma and victimization that they've experienced, that it can oftentimes lead into hooking up with partners who are just simply not good for them because they don't know what healthy looks like. Lastly, I'll say, women also disproportionately have higher rates of co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders, of course, in behavioral health spaces in comparison to men. And so some of the research that I've been involved with demonstrates that even just symptoms of depression and anxiety are actually criminogenic for women. And that oftentimes gets subsumed in our correctional rehabilitation model under sort of specific responsivity factors. And that tells us actually if those are criminogenic needs, and those are things that are also risk factors for justice-involved women to continue ongoing offending. And then economic marginality. All of this is just to say that women are still economically and socially marginalized far more than men. I think, the Department of Labor statistics are like, for every dollar that men earn in the United States, women still are earning 82 cents. For every dollar white men earn in the US, Black women are earning 68 cents and Hispanic women 62 cents. And so economic marginality, trauma, mental health, substance use, sometimes they all look the same on paper and on an assessment, but in reality, these needs get manifested in very different ways for women, and in particular, women of color.
Great, thank you, Emily. And I just wrote down what you said, that they look the same on paper, but manifest in different ways. I think that's a really poignant way to put it. So and you started to allude to this, but it's certainly an understatement to say that we have a long history of structural racism in our country, in the United States. And we know that these structural inequities have led to the overrepresentation of communities of color in our prison, the overrepresentation of specifically Black women in our prisons. And I'd like to invite Michelle to reflect on these structural inequities and how they interact with the pathways to incarceration that you just outlined, Emily. And Michelle, you are on mute.
I appreciate you, Emily, for that breakdown. But I'd like to say that in our current neoliberal system, our personal failures, our inability to just get it right and get our lives together and just figure it out, right, denies the fact that structural inequities are like literally baked into all of our institutions, and government, schools, universities, healthcare, and the criminal legal system. These are like active discriminatory practices, right, that are impacting women based on their race, their sex, their gender, and particularly criminality, right? Because criminality has such a way of leaving this taint upon us that literally feeds us back into the system. And we're battling the trauma that comes with the situation before incarceration, the actual living of incarceration in those spaces, with all the lack and precarity that's baked into it, and then trying to do reentry and meet all the collateral consequences that follow, which for us, it means meeting a lot of stigma being weaponized against us and curtailing our access to resources and opportunities, and often with crippling results. And for women, the overall lack of supports impacts not only just them, but largely their children. And I'll give one example and then I'll pass the mic. There's a friend of mine who is a woman of color. She had a child while incarcerated. When she got out, there were very few supports for her in our community. In our state, there was 52 beds available for work release opportunities for women coming home, and not with their children. So her child goes somewhere else for care. She's over here. Okay, so she works her way back, tries to get a job, tries to get housing. But there are so many no's and denials in that she literally goes through a series of depression that actually impacts her ability to get her children back, right? And she has a relapse. And so now she has 2 criminal convictions against her because she couldn't figure out a pathway, a holistic pathway for reentry, because the resources and supports weren't there. And you just can't figure it out all the time on your own and just make yourself healthy. You actually need community supports to do that. And so she struggled to get her child back and to get back on her feet. But now she has this other conviction history that puts a further taint upon her. And so now she's out again trying to put her life together. But she has these criminal histories now. And the fact that she missed some appointments with the people who are watching over children in the system. And she is struggling multiple years now out of incarceration just to get back her parental rights. This is a system that is completely broken down. And for us who've been impacted by this system, I mean, it can be quite debilitating. And women are unable to, some women are unable to make it over the hump of the impact of these structural inequities. And I want people to understand just how pervasive they are, because it impacted her ability to get her apartment, to get her job, to get family reunification accomplished, and on and on and on and on, right? So they're pervasive, the structural inequities, and they impact on multiple levels and multiple ways upon the lives of women, and then all of the children that are also a part of the families. Yeah, so it's a spread. It's like a disease. Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. And that, I think you really just talked about this, is the cyclical nature, that these aren't isolated incidents. These compound upon each other over and over and over again, including prior to incarceration, during incarceration, and then upon reentry for women and their children and their communities.
Absolutely.
So I have a question also for you, Michelle. So I'd like to pivot to talking about prison conditions specifically for women. And I know that you recently co-edited and then co-authored a book with actually 9 authors that are formerly and also currently incarcerated. And this book focuses on the history of the first women's prison in Indiana. So I'm wondering if you can share what we know about conditions of confinement for women in prison historically, and then also what do those conditions look like today?
Right. In the earliest days, the first prison places that women were incarcerated were not actual separate facilities. Most women were incarcerated in co-ed prison facilities. If they were incarcerated at all in the South, particularly, white women were not sentenced to prison itself. Black women went to prison, as well as men and Black men and white men. But the women were sentenced, incarcerated in co-ed prison facilities where a dorm or a building inside the facility was dedicated to them and male guards watched over them. In our research, we found out that the female department in Indiana was used largely as a brothel, and guards were able to sexually abuse the women that came into that facility. The warden charged them $10 a month for the access. The conditions of confinement of women during this period were such that they were also made to be the cooks and the domestics and the maids, and generally serve the will of the superintendent and other men in the facility. Children were born. Sexual and gender violence was sort of the order of the day. And women were also beaten just like men with the cat of nine tails, which is a strap with leather attached to it and barbs on the end, right? And then benevolent reformers stepped in. In our state, they separated women into their own facility, and that was considered a major reform. However, a prison led by women, created for women, was not the haven that especially when women leaders replicated practices of incarcerating women that were also violent and sexualized. Whether it was Catholic or Quaker or other, women and girls suffered greatly under the incarceration of women reformers. And that's some of the research that we found. Further, once slavery ended and doctors no longer had a large ready pool of Black bodies to experiment on, the next cordoned off population were incarcerated people. And in our state, our book highlights how incarcerated women and girls' bodies became sites of experimentation and exploitation under the authority of these women leaders. Today, we can see the red thread. In my current research that I'm working on for my dissertation, I'm highlighting current reports of officers physically and sexually abusing incarcerated women. I'm reporting on an officer sneaking a woman out of the prison at night to have an abortion. And we know that incarcerated women were subjected to sterilizations against their will in recent years. The point I like to highlight is this. Women who were creating the very first prisons for women in the entire country thought deeply about their purpose and their work in the world and how to help women and girls. Yet their only plan really to follow existing practices of incarceration with a vase of flowers and a doily on a table. These practices highlighted sexual and gendered violence and saw the women only as fit for domestic service and or marriage. And fundamentally, they didn't see the potential of these women and girls to become like themselves, educators, leaders, and businesswomen. And today, incarcerated women fight enduring infantilism, where we are stripped of autonomy and personal accountability. For example, if something happens on a housing unit dorm, the whole dorm is punished. If something happens over here, we all lose opportunity. However, I will say that we are finding ways in this broken system to scrape together resources and embrace opportunity whenever it comes. The red thread of history also reflects resilience and the ability to survive. And the methodology in our book kind of speaks to that, right? Because we talk about the difference between traditional depictions of incarcerated people in scholarly research is rarely that of the skillful, competent, and worthy human being, right? Subjectivity is inherent in all research, and especially ethnography. So as incarcerated and formerly incarcerated scholars, we seek to privilege our experience of incarceration so that the past, our stories, local and global, the present, our communities, cultures, languages, and social practices are not only spaces of marginalization, but are also spaces of resistance and hope. And so incarcerated scholars, we intimately understand the experience of marginalization, secrecy, and subjection, but we're also able to comprehend systemic subjugation of others through our own experiences. So unearthing those human stories and those structures and formations at work that created the subjugated experience is a vital strength that we've been bringing to our research and our work. And we call that methodology the embodied observer, right? So it's one who views the archive from the position of a captive, from inside the experience.
Thank you, Michelle, for sharing that. And it reminds me of Dorothy Roberts' book of Killing the Black Body. And I was hearing parts of the framework that you were using that very much resonate from that scholarly contribution. I would just like to pause to say a reminder to our audience that you can put questions in the chat, and then we will get to those questions towards the end of our discussion. So I'd like to invite Amanda to join in on the conversation. You are the Director of Women's Services at the Maine Department of Corrections. And as a correctional leader, I'm wondering if you can speak to about how you work to improve conditions of confinement and meeting the needs of incarcerated women in Maine, building on the framework that Emily and Michelle have set out for us for this conversation.
Yes, thank you, Evelyn. Thank you for having me. And Michelle and Emily did a great job of really teeing up, a lot of the things that we're doing here in Maine, because we do recognize all the things, the racial, disparities, the pathways, and all the differences that women end up in our carceral system. One of the points that Michelle had made is that these systems aren't built for women. And unfortunately, Maine is one of those unique places where our women's prison is still located at a men's facility. So it is a unit attached. So of course that comes with its own host of challenges itself. And those are the things that we've really worked on in the last decade plus of really wading through is how do we make this our own. One of the spaces that we really started with was our risk assessment tools. We started using a gender responsive risk assessment tool, and after having about 10 years of data with that tool, we started to think classification and our risk assessment tool, they need to speak to each other. There was a lot of research that women would be overclassified. So we took a deep dive into that, and we got some TA and dug into what really were the predictive factors for women, behaviorally, socially, criminogenic needs, all those things. And we developed a gender responsive classification tool. And very quickly, the pendulum swung, right? So all of a sudden we had this much larger population of minimum and community custody women. So we had to build the system around that. So 2017, we had the opportunity to build a new reentry center. And it wasn't just the vase and the doily that Michelle spoke about. This was a space for women, full of light, full of color, full of choice, a real residential feeling system, dormitory style. And the women had a lot of input into it. Again, I keep, saying back to what Michelle said, but Michelle's a subject matter expert here, and we know that. So bringing those women's voices into decision-making, policy-making, it's paramount and it has to happen if we want to make change and we want to make a space that's safe for them. Again, that's part of it is the policy work, right? Is having policies that aren't just cut and pasted from the men's side of the house just because they're all under one umbrella, right? Pregnancy and postpartum, there has to be specific policies for that. There has to be specific procedures for that. Uses of force, it's inherently different on women. Their experience is a lot different. We don't use violence as much as women. So when a use of force happens, the after work is just as important as the calculation of, are we going to use force on this individual? Searches, a body search is one of the most invasive things that we could possibly do. And when we talk about power and control and all these things is, we have to be really intentional about when and where and why, and have reasons behind all of it. And the reason cannot be because we've always done it this way. So right. Just the intentionality of everything that goes on operationally, hygiene, that one stuck in my craw for so long. You have these national commissary companies that do honestly a poor job of making sure that you have ethnic products in stock, female products in stock, and quality ones, not just the, I'm sorry, as somebody coming into her 40, I'm going to pay good money for a good face cream. These things are important to women, and understanding the importance of these products, has been kind of overlooked. It's not just about ramens and, noodle packets and chips. It's about what can we, use to feel better about ourselves. And I cannot understate the importance of education. The opportunities that the women do not have in the community, they need to be afforded in our facilities. The research and the data behind why education is so important. We do a return to custody because Maine is a bifurcated system, so we don't have great county data coming back into our state system. So we do a return to custody, calculations. And for 21 and 20 and 21, we had a 0% return to custody rate for any woman who left with a high school equivalency or higher. So associates, it did not matter their classification level. If they had that as education, they have not come back to us. And those are real numbers. That's putting your money where your mouth is. So all those important things when it comes to operations. We also cannot, back to what we said about including their voice, resident advisory councils, peer-led opportunities, opportunity scholars, like Michelle said, we have some really smart folks they understand the system, and they understand the policies and the effects. So bringing them in, we have an amazing opportunity with the Mellon Foundation through CEPP, that we have a group called Opportunity Scholars. And these are folks who are in our educational programs, and they get together and they pull apart policies. They pull apart, emerging adults and women's issues and all these things. And then they make suggestions and recommendations back to the department. And, there's a policy review behind it. So it's not just, well, we want this because we said so. It's, hey, let's take a look at this because it makes sense. So I think there's so many different avenues that you can take to just improve. And it doesn't all have to be at once. You take it's like eating the elephant, right? You take one bite at a time, and slowly and surely you're going to make a better system.
That's good.
Emily or Michelle, did you want to say anything in response to that at all?
Sure. So Amanda, I really appreciate you said that these things are important to women and helping women feel better about themselves, by providing access to resources and opportunity. But writ large, right, the carceral system needs a lot of work, because men and women inside it are not considered people who have concerns, who have a voice, who need access to resources and opportunity. They're considered criminals and not mothers and sisters and cousins and daughters. And, I'm at bare basics here. And I feel like that's where a lot of places need to start. Public policy, prison policy has to start with the idea that the person incarcerated there is a person. And I know that sounds very cliche and trite, but a lot of people do not start there. They start with monster, and monster is the caged thing, the thing that needs to be controlled. It has no conscience and no ability to control its own behavior, has no autonomy, can't do personal self-accountability. And I understand how civil death works when it's based on conviction of a crime. It's connected to social death. Social death based on a conviction of crime can result in a taint and the spreading of the taint of criminality throughout people's lives. I understand how all of that works. And I think that delinking, crime itself is not causal, okay? So delinking human beings from personhood in the law and public policy and prison practice is ultimately fatalistic to the human family. We do not get better the more we perpetuate this idea that the incarcerated person is other, right? So, and the people who are harmed by the people who commit harm, they're not healed either, right? Because the people who are incarcerated or locked away in a hole, and the people who have a harm or been wounded are over here. And someone, this person over here, these people over here, this block, this community doesn't have any opportunity to heal. That this person over here who's committed the harm can actually participate in and actually help to heal the scar, the wound in the family. They're going through their own hell through the trauma of incarceration itself, with sexual and gendered violence and rape and all, and the lack of opportunity and proper health care and roaches and rats everywhere. This is what they're going through, right? But the community over here has its own wounds that are not being dealt with, right? Because our current system of incarceration, the way in which the criminal legal system works, is it keeps the two divided. And you can't heal anything in the hand. You can't heal what you can't call out and what you can't name. And you can't heal what you don't bring together for conversation. And sometimes the people over here are so wounded, they end up giving their progeny, their children, their siblings, their family members also become a part of a population that ends up over here and incarcerated, right? And so the current way we're even thinking about incarceration in this country is not focused on incarcerated people being eligible for personhood, having the right of access to resources and opportunity, and the ability to connect for healing and for restoration. Like restoration is not even a part of our current paradigm. So I love the things that are happening in Maine that Amanda's talking about, because the whole human family is suffering. And the way we're suffering, it's going to take a lot of what Amanda's doing times 1,000 and cross all planes to kind of get back to some places where when someone does a harm, there's a path to heal that harm, because right now the current practices are fatalistic to the human family.
I thank you so much to both of you for just contributing to such a rich conversation. I've been working with lots of different departments of corrections over my career, and being sort of mid-career, it's so wonderful to hear the real positive outcomes that Maine and Amanda's team has really been a part of.
Yeah,
that is an exception to what we see in departments of corrections and in carceral spaces. It is, for better or for worse, gender responsive and trauma responsive strategies have now become the buzzword of what to do and what we should be doing for incarcerated women. We are in a space now, right, where many DOCs want to check a box and say we are doing gender and trauma responsive strategies. And I cannot emphasize enough that it is far more than having the right assessment tool. It is far more than having some programs. It is far more than what most executive leaders and what most mid-level managers think it is. When we come in and start to help implement these strategies, the DOCs and executive leadership have no idea that the sexism and racism within their own organization is going to come up. And if they are not ready, willing, and prepared to discuss it, it naturally comes up because of the conversations that we get real, right? We get real and we get raw about what women are facing every day in the system. And so because these systems were never designed to recognize and address the social harms and complex needs of anyone, let alone women, it takes a very careful intentionality, as Amanda said multiple times, intentionality about how this operates, because women have, of course, forever really been ignored and afterthought and dismissed. And the system itself really wants to keep going back to what we know with men. It is very, very difficult, very, very difficult work. And I'll just give an example, a state that will remain unnamed. have been working with them for literally 10 years to try to help them implement best practices for women. And they just can't seem to get the pre-implementation stages in the right place for the right people to understand why this needs to happen and the policies that need to change in order for not just to embrace the strategies that we need to have in place, but to sustain it. Because so often it's one woman who's the champion for the incarcerated women. And it takes far more than that to put these practices in place and to sustain it over time. We are seeing more and more divisions of women's services be created in departments of corrections, like in Maine and other places, which is great news. They need to be in central office and in headquarters to be able to understand how when policies come down, how is it going to affect the entire system, including the women. But I can't emphasize enough the preparation and the careful vetting that I have to do, and that many others like Michelle have to do, in order to make sure that these agencies really mean what they say in terms of wanting to put these practices in place and to sustain it.
Thank you both. And I think that really underscores and appreciate the comment about how Maine is very different from many different women's prisons and departments of corrections. And what I was thinking about when all three of you were talking is that how do you implement a gender responsive or a trauma informed program when someone might not have basic period products during their incarceration? And so you think of these really basic needs and then these more advanced long-term needs, and how do you meld them together? That's very challenging. So I'd like to ask first Michelle and then hear again from Emily, but you've both extensively researched the experiences of needs of incarcerated women and these conditions. So what would you say are these gaps in prison policy and practice that you're often seeing when you're working with prisons?
The gaps. So the gaps.
Well, I mean,
There's so much, right? There's so much. The gaps are rooted in the very fact that I personally feel that people who know these systems, who have been a part of these systems, are not a part of the conversation about what public policy looks like. We are very few of us are at the table about what needs to happen. And we are always battling what we see as a monolithic Department of Correction, holistic entity that will batter against departments of ed and batter against the health departments and batter against the small community-based organizations or the HEP that's trying to higher education and prison program that's trying to come into the facilities. The gaps is a consciousness that views those entities as monolithic. I think that one of the things that I have found in working with the folks that we've worked with is that we have to remind ourselves that these are individuals that have also received a training, that have also received a skill that is working from a set of assumptions and beliefs about who incarcerated people are. And so just like Emily said, we have to get in a room with these people and begin to dismantle that type of consciousness that is oriented towards looking at incarcerated people as a population that is undeserving of basic rights, such as access to education, access to programming, access to tampons, right? We have to get into those spaces with those human beings and actually break down the consciousness that bolsters up those systems. And public policy comes from human beings sitting around at a typewriter, at a printer, at a computer, making shit up, right? And so the people who are making those public policies, it's coming from a consciousness, be it political moves of lobbyists, be it interest from correctional unions, be it interest from victim organizations. I think that all of that comes together and impacts what prison policy ultimately looks like. And then you have people who are campaigning, trying to look like they're tough on crime, right? Until they decide that, oh, now it's a time to look like we are interested in reentry, or until it's time to say we're interested in women's reproductive health. I mean, it's so flighty, right? And so part of it is supported by a consciousness that incarcerated people are not people and don't have rights of access to basic things, to basic care, basic needs. And if we have to debunk that every single time, you know, there are people who will say, oh, Michelle, I love this idea of this program, but in your paperwork, you said incarcerated people. You know, the DLC won't respond to that. They need to hear offender, inmate, prisoner. They need to hear that language in order to hear what you're talking about. And I say, you're talking about the DLC as if it's a monolithic giant, but in fact, they're human beings that we can talk to and break down some of that consciousness. And that requires people getting uncomfortable and sitting in rooms and having really hard conversations. I think that the public policy, the gaps in prison policy, primarily is related around that they do not see this population as worthy of care, opportunity, access, and resources. That's a fundamental thing that taints everything because this person has committed a harm. But as we know, everybody locked up hasn't done something to somebody. people become incarcerated for a lot of reasons, not just because they've actually committed a crime. And so those many, many layers are not at the table of the creation of public policy and prison policy. We are not, and it's fundamentally related to, and it impairs our ability to get access to resources and opportunity. It impairs our ability to be heard at certain tables. And it requires us to come together, all of those groups, to kind of change that consciousness. Because if you have over between 70 and 100 million people with criminal records, I bet you can't walk in a room today, anywhere, church, library, grocery store, the mall, and run into anybody and run into a place where there's 0 people who have not been impacted by incarceration. Like, get over it. You know, it is something that is proliferated in our very culture today. So we need to be thinking about how to bring those people who are our people back into our society with the resources that they need to not go back. But if you think of that person as animal or other or monster, then you don't think that that human being has a right to that. And that's just a fundamental problem with this entire system as it sits now.
And I think, you know, just some of the specific, you know, policies and things that you know, I'm oftentimes working with DOCs and detention facilities around are just pretty basic things that I would hope agencies would consider. Like, if you're going to think about adopting a gender responsive risk, you know, needs assessment, like the WRNA, the Women's Risk Need Assessment, or the SPIN-W, right? Like, maybe you need to look at your policy about whether or not it's legislatively mandated that you use a particular assessment tool, like a gender neutral or a male derived risk assessment tool. Because one of the hardest things about implementing a new assessment is people got to practice a new tool, and there's no reason to do 2 of them. Like, we're not here to over assess women, and we don't have the staffing levels anyway to do it. So, you know, what is it in policy around your assessment tool? So for those of you who are listening in and in the audience, like, that's step 1 for even thinking about adopting a gender responsive and trauma responsive assessment tool. What are your current policies around what you should be doing? I have served as an expert witness on a case with a union suing a Department of Corrections because of the DOC's BFOQ, bona fide occupational qualifications that they put in place specifically for the women's prisons, where in the private spaces of the women's prisons, they wanted to have, you know, women only posts for those custody officers, so that it's only women, right? Like, because of the safety, to create the safety, but the union sued. And so it's like, it gets down to very specific levels when we're going to put these strategies in place that oftentimes, again, DOCs need to think about and recognize. And the timing has to be right, and the programs and interventions and the people who are most affected need to be a part of the conversations always.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you both.
Totally.
So we've talked a lot about challenges, and there certainly are many more that we could talk about the challenges that women face in prison and the challenges that prisons face in delivering a lot of these services or programs. But I'm wondering if Amanda first, and then Emily and Michelle, if you want to share any reflections on successes that you've seen either around programs or policy changes that can support women.
Yes, a lot. I mean, I think, you know, we've talked a lot about the challenges, but you know, we're in a time where there has been, you know, great research and great information that has come to us in the last 2 decades, right? You've got these folks like Emily and you know, Stephanie Covington and Becky Nay and Marilyn Van Deeten did a ton of research, and they handed it to us on a silver platter. They were just like, take this information and run with it. So we've been able to get a lot done. We've been able to create policies, create positions. Is there a lot of work still to be done? Absolutely. You know, are we just kind of getting to a place where we're like, you know, this incarceration thing it's a public health issue, and in completely taking the lens and shifting it over to say, you know what, we need to treat the whole person and not just this, oh, we don't commit crimes again. Well, that's a very easy thing to say, but how is that going to actually happen? We need to address the trauma. We need to address all those underlying mental health issues. We need to stop saying, no, we can't do that because of the situation, and say, how can we do this safely? You know, an example of that would be ADHD medication. It's always been a hard no, right? No stimulants in prison settings or jail settings. But you know what? Some of us need that to get through a program. And if you're not going to get through the program, then you're not going to get treatment, and it's just going to keep cycling back around. So, you know, I think, you know, if I can impart anything, is find folks who are not risk adverse. You need to have champions within these departments who are willing to at least try, or willing to find safe ways to accomplish, you know, pretty big asks of shifting systems. And I think those people exist. So I would say those are some wins that we've found champions that have taken all of this research and all of this information and said, hey, I'm willing to try something here. Just give me the space to do it. Let me run. And you know, Emily said, you know, you've got some of these strong women in these departments and spaces, and more, you know, Vermont and Arizona now, and, you know, Georgia and Tennessee have created these directors of women's programs. But they have, again, you know, Emily's point of the central office and that they have to have the authority to implement. If not, then there's just your department's, you know, suggestion box, and that's all well and good, but if you don't have boots on the ground getting those actions accomplished, then you haven't really made any strides. So I'll leave it at that and let Michelle and Emily chime in.
Yeah, some of the best strategies that I've ever seen, you know, they cultivate environments based off safety, dignity, and respect for women that empowers them to begin the journey, you know, towards health and healing. Environments that really disrupt the kind of typical prison politics that naturally occur when we deprive people of liberty and the things that they need, the goods and services, and sort of, you know, the things that they need to heal. And so, you know, no one can really do the deep, personal, difficult, internal work of choosing a different path when they aren't safe.
That's right.
If you're not going to create, if you do nothing else in your institutions and in the prison, you create safety however you can. There are plenty of solutions on how to do that. But when people are not supported by their environment or given the skills that they need to move forward, we can't expect anything different. And I would encourage, you know, prison systems, I oftentimes hear people say in executive leadership, you know, we can't control who comes to us.
Mm-hmm.
I get that from a perspective of, you know, sentencing, but it's time for prisons and DOCs to think about who they have. They do control who can come back to them, right? And the things that they put in place on behalf of women, their families, and of course, in community safety. One of the best programs I've ever seen, I was involved with the Pathfinder Network years ago, which is a nonprofit out of Oregon. I helped them. They implemented a transition of a therapeutic community in a women's prison that, you know, was an intensive outpatient sort of program, specifically, of course, around substance use. I don't know how many TCs we have in women's prisons, but we need to rethink them on behalf of justice-involved women. And there are strategies to do that, where you create an empowerment model, because many of the relational aggressions that women know how to get under each other's skin in the incarcerated setting need to be changed and reframed so that they can create safety amongst each other. And the hierarchical nature of TCs are problematic for women. So we created an empowerment community instead of a TC. Unfortunately, got closed during the pandemic. And I need to see these sorts of programs come back. So yeah, I know we're running out of time, so I need to stop.
Well, and really quick, I appreciate what you're saying so much, because we could talk about MOUs and community organizing and capacity building behind bars, or the use of retired faculty and correctional officers. We could talk about mobilizing district legislatures and all of that to support programming, right? And there are a lot of great programs out there that help incarcerated women. I'm thinking of Use What You Got Ministries, right? They literally just go pick up your kids and bring your kids to you to visit. And that's like the thing that they can do with the vehicles and the things that they have, right? And then there's people who bring in all kinds of programming, yoga, meditation, Tai Chi. But the programming, in a lot of ways, is less important than the consciousness of the people coming in and delivering the program. It's how you treat individuals once you come in. Am I a fully human adult woman? Can I be a mother, auntie, sister, cousin, grandma? The most successful programs come in and recognize that incarcerated women are a part of the human family and have rights to programming and education, the right to exercise their mental faculties and abilities. They have the right to access to opportunities so that they can heal themselves, right? And heal the other people in their sphere, right? Because there's trauma all around, on the housing unit, on the family, on the phone call, right? But what is sad is that a lot of programs, right, don't have that orientation, and some of them take the role of filling in a volunteer role that the correctional facility needs but those that do have it, they have to walk a tightrope, right, with the natural tension that exists between departments of corrections that don't always see incarcerated people as full human beings. And then there's the tension between people who are like, I have this consciousness that you are a human, right? Those people bringing in programming have to walk a tightrope. And you know what? I acknowledge that it can be hard. And I just want to say that those people who walk that tightrope every single day, I am grateful for you. I am thankful for you, because you are going up against individuals in a system that seems permanent, almighty, and you're saying, I'm going to go in anyway, with a consciousness that I'm getting ready to engage these beautiful, fully human adult women, and I appreciate you. That's all I'm going to say.
Great. Thank you, all three of you. And I'm going to pivot us briefly to the Q&A, because we have a lot of different really fantastic questions in the Q&A. And so something that I saw in the questions that someone asked is if you could talk about what types of reentry needs women have and how we can better support them during reentry, and what specific obstacles they may face. What are some tips and resources you would recommend? So I wonder if, Michelle, you want to kick us off, and then Amanda and Emily.
Yeah, I think resources include the reality that women come out often with needing to pay fines and fees and have to pay for electronic monitoring, but they don't have any money. And so resources and connections that can help them stay above board with those systems, because guess what? It produces an anxiety, literally a heat behind the neck. Like, oh my God, if I don't pay this week's electronic monitoring, are they going to rearrest me? Am I going to go back in? And people end up doing different things to avoid the potential penalties of reincarceration, right? Mental health needs, like mental and physical health supports. Some facilities actually do the work to connect people to resources when they get out, but most do not. And so resources that actually let someone to come in and get a baseline care. What is my health now that I've been incarcerated in this cesspool? What is my mental health now that I've been in this cesspool? What's my teeth like? Do you know how many women are losing their teeth because they've come home and they've been denied care, right? Help, and in addition to supports to maintaining sobriety. And honestly, women just need to feel like they're welcomed back, right? That they have a sense of belonging, that their life and existence on this planet matters, and that includes listening to them, hearing what their concerns are, hearing and then helping them think through. In our facility, at Constructing Our Future, the women are on a 3-goal rule, right? So at any time they're working on 3 goals, finding something achievable and a couple goals that the woman can accomplish when they first get out is such a huge deal. When they achieve that thing, then they can look at the next thing and they can look at the next thing. But honestly, it just requires providing a space of belonging, that you belong here, you are important and you're valuable, and we're going to help you. And that orientation, as opposed to carceral bureaucracy, that you're a problem, you're in the way, you're number 468, I need to get done before I go to lunch. that orientation is not helpful.
Yeah, so I'll just add, I mean, Michelle hit a lot of great points there, but that financial stability is a huge thing. If you have space and opportunity to provide women either jobs on the inside or a supportive reentry where they can go out and work and earn a wage, please do that. Like, that is number one. Number two, I would say housing. I mean, our housing in this country is dismal. But again, when you're talking about the prison setting itself, if we don't have safe housing for them on the outside, it was all for naught. We have to find safe housing. We have to have affordable housing. These women have to have access to living wage jobs, not minimum wage jobs, because there's a difference. And that's where the education and vocational opportunities come in while they're inside, is so they can go out and support themselves. They want to support themselves. Michelle's beating it over the head. They don't want to be a burden to anybody. They've already got all of those labels. They want to be successful. They want to do the hard work. You have to give them pathways to do that.
And I would just say that the motivators for behavior change with women look very different oftentimes than it does with men. They're motivated by the relationships they have in their life, the extent to which you can help them understand they want to reconnect with their children. And the economic marginality of these women is so real. We need to provide jobs that are going to take care of themselves and their children, because they're the primary caregivers of their kiddos. A model that seemed to be pretty successful in an RC randomized control trial that I did in Multnomah County, Oregon, was to connect community health specialists with probation officers, because we are asking too much of our POs lately. I'm sorry, we just are. Like, we need community health specialists to help understand the social determinants of health for women, like to help them get transportation, access to housing, sign up for Medicaid, like all of the different basic human needs that people are needing to navigate, that oftentimes probation staff just simply don't have the time to do. And so whose job is it? It's all of our jobs, right? Wherever there are problems, community is always the answer.
Yeah, that's good.
So I'm going to ask one last question to each of our panelists, and this is a big question, but perhaps you can make your answer as brief as possible, as we're running out of time. But what would success look like for this space within the next 5 years? What would you like to see? And Amanda, I'll have you go first.
I guess real quick, if I have to, going back to my point about this is a public health issue. We need to address it as a public health issue. And Emily and Michelle, and we've all said it, we need to stop building fences and build community. And this just not just for women, but this is for men as well. But my heart's with the ladies. So I will say, take a public health approach to the issues that we have in front of us.
Great, thank you. Emily?
Mass decarceration. Yeah, mass decarceration, and if, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah. I appreciate that, because that was my number one thought, mass decarceration, because we overuse incarceration. There are people who are incarcerated today who should not be behind bars. The next thing I would say is that we need to end privatized mental and health care behind bars, because I am an abolitionist. I feel like we need to get rid of these systems, but until we do, we need to provide equitable health care behind bars. And a for-profit privatized healthcare provider that is not incentivized to provide good quality health care to clients who are locked away and out of public view, and they receive bonuses the less money they spend. I'm sorry, it's not helping anyone. It's not helping to heal the human family. And it's such a violation to write these contracts with these folks, right? And then we need nonpartisan, non-governmental oversight mechanisms of corrections. I'm sorry, people who have right of key access across the country, because these facilities are operating because of our money and our tax funds. These people need to be able to go in, report on what they learned, and that there has a meaningful impact on salaries, positions, jobs. You know, right now, there's only 3 oversight mechanisms in the country, and they only have recommendation power. And all sorts of things happen behind the walls. Women and men are cordoned off and secretive off and out of public view. And I'm sorry, while we're on this pathway to abolition and decarceration, we cannot neglect the day-to-day existence of men and women behind bars. And that means we need to be able to have an entity go in and see and tell.
I think we'll end there. Thank you so much to Michelle, to Emily, and Amanda for being fantastic panelists, for uplifting the issues that women in prison face. And we will circulate the recording and then as well as the speaker email addresses if you'd like to get in touch directly. So thank you again, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, guys.